wait a minute, this reminds me of this panel I was in 2017 around climate risk and net zero and climate change. And I was on the panel speaking. And I think it's a mix of, I don't know, fear of the topic, this sort of wrong impression that it will be solved by the regulator, that you can't do anything that you could still keep going on, like an error towards the inaction. And or that there's going to be a deus ex machina that's going to come in and solve it for you. But all the challenges we're discussing today, all the work we're doing is profoundly disrupted by artificial intelligence. But the point is, we need to be asking ourselves today the question of reliance and the question of education and training. And similarly to climate change, I think we need to be just less scared.
Welcome to the Future in Sound podcast. I'm your host, Jenn Wilson. This is a podcast where we discuss people, planet, and profit. In each episode, we'll learn from world-leading experts who can help us see the future we want and our role in it. This is episode 37, Staying Nimble. Cornelia Gomez is Global Head of Sustainability at General Atlantic. In this role, she oversees the firm's strategy to advance environmental, social, and governance efforts for global operations and across its portfolio. Before joining General Atlantic in 2022, Cornelia was head of ESG and sustainability at PAI Partners, and she also served as the global coordinator for the International Climate Initiative, a private equity industry group that is sponsored by the United Nations Principles for Responsible Investment. Previously, Cornelia led the Social and Environmental Compliance Unit at Casina Group. Cornelia, welcome to the Future in Sound podcast.
Thank you for having me, Jen. I'm delighted to be here.
I'm really fascinated by your background. You've been in sustainability for well over a decade. You've seen different trends in this space, and I'm really interested just to start, Cornelia, with what attracted you to corporate sustainability in the first place?
What really attracted me to the space was this intimate conviction that the solution is in business, where the money flows, basically. I do really love business. I love the idea that you can build a company, a factory, find a market, create a product and service that meets its customer where they are. And by doing so, you're connected to so many stakeholders. So I studied business and economics, and I was from sort of long time ago, it was very clear to me that, business had an influence beyond, just its customers and clients. There, obviously employees, suppliers, the local communities, and it has its obviously shareholders, relationship with regulators. And it was actually quite fascinating to me that it had been theorized, this notion of stakeholder capitalism had been only really theorized and put in practice quite recently in the history of business, but had been practiced in practice. Great business leaders had been thinking about it since really the start of business. And I think that what I was seeing and what I was observing was, what we've all been observing, sort of rising inequality. And as the whole pie was growing, not everybody gets sort of an equal share of it. And at the time, I remember thinking, should I go work in an NGO or should I go work for an international institution? And then I discovered the existence of a job called corporate sustainability. And I thought, God has sent this job to me. And it was very nascent when I joined Casino. It was often sort of an offshoot of, a team. And it was often linked to reporting. It was very present in some very specific corporate sectors. And as you and I are sustainability professionals, and sometimes, it can be a little disenchanting how slow the progress is, but I think we should take a step back and reflect on the unbelievable progress of this function in the last 15. So I've been working for more than 15 years, but if you think in the last 20 years, I mean, when I started, I had 0 enemies. So, people didn't care enough to want to oppose, an idea, and today how cool to have an anti-ESG backlash in a way, because it goes to show that it's this function and this way of thinking about business has taken a more central role.
I think that's such a good point. I'm thinking back to when I was deciding what to study in undergrad, and I really wanted to combine sustainability and business. And I talked to the registrar for the university where I was studying, and at that time, there was a physical book of which courses you could study and which degrees. And she sort of, as I'm speaking to her, her like glasses are at the end of her nose. She looks down and she like licks her finger and she flips through the book. She opens it, she turns it toward me, and she's like, you can study business and math or business in Spanish or business in French, but there's no business in, and she must have just thought I was a bit crazy, what? And now today there are so many programs out there. So you're right, we have come so far. And at the same time, we're at this really interesting point. And I'm really looking forward to getting into where we are. Before we get there, I want to ask, okay, so you spent some time in corporate sustainability. We're going to get into a bit more detail on supply chains later.
Yeah.
Why private equity?
I think that after 5 years at Casino and focusing at my role there was, just to rephrase the title, which was very arcane and very French. Really, my role was to monitor supply chain, the non-food and non-food supply chain, and spend time with factories and suppliers, understanding the labor condition and environmental condition in the supply chains. But I think I hit this ceiling, that a lot of us will have hit in a corporate context, which it's a one unit. It can be vertical or horizontal management. The point is the throne comes from the top. You have one committee, you have one strategy, one roadmap, and you should be focusing on what's material to that business. And for very curious minds, I think that, you hit a bit of a limit. And then I discovered, by chance, the function of ESG or head of ESG in a private equity context in 2017, when there were very few heads of ESG out there. I was very lucky to get this role at PAI, which was a sort of a first sort of greenfield role. And gosh, those times were good, like if you were, especially in France, because we were enabled by regulation, by a set of sort of very proactive limited partners. And the sky was the limit. It's one of those very exciting 2-3 years that got sort of turbocharged by COVID. COVID really sort of like emphasized that bubble, that ESG bubble. And, you could create a climate initiative for GPs. You could get PRI to sponsor ideas. All the guides had to be written. As a majority shareholder, you could go to companies and get them to measure the carbon footprint. I think corporates didn't have antibodies, and the management of private equity firms didn't have the antibodies that they have today. It's sometimes, frankly, fairly like the fair antibodies, so you could be pushing the agenda. And I think actually there's a very good aspect to it. So, I mean, I remember going from 0 to 5 at PAI in terms of resources of FTEs. We went into Article 8 SFDR. We looked at a science-based target for the fund. We were doing those sort of like systematic approaches. We were running some exciting DEI initiatives. There was a lot of engagement. Once you found the right advisor, you could sort of push it to the whole portfolio. And I remember even like, data incredibly well, but this was the time where you were hesitating between asking 150 and 200 questions to a company, which is insane. You should not be asking 200 questions to a company. But those were the days, And I think the problem is that probably there was a bit of a hubris, if I'm honest, like stupid questions were flying around, way too many questionnaires, not enough standardization, a lot of ego within initiatives. And I'm going to say it, and I feel like it's okay for me to say it. In my opinion, woke is such a negative and such strongly charged word now. But to be honest, like some of the questions we were receiving were insane, completely immaterial, completely financially immaterial to a company's ability to grow, stay in business, maintain its employee workforce. Are you offering vegan food at the canteen? It's not a question you should be asking to the manufacturer of like metal shutter sliding doors in the south of France, which is questions we got through a debt provider, and the bubble kept growing. I don't know if you experienced that too, but I remember thinking this is not going to end well. yeah, the talent bench is increasing, but this whole thing is becoming too big, too expensive, and really not connected to business. We're becoming siloed. We're actually becoming the compliance teams instead of becoming the sort of the operators of value creation, And lo and behold, like you know the rest of the story. I think we're now experiencing obviously a pretty, in a very interesting slump in that story. The sort of bursting of the bubble and a lot of questions around, but everywhere, like a lot of questions around frameworks, around the B Corp guidance. When you have too many companies trying to become B Corp, too many corporates and private markets players trying to sign up to a science-based target, there's a real question as to whether you're devaluing, or you're watering down the principles and the frameworks. And so how do you stay true to yourself when you grow? And that's a question that all the big initiatives out there have had to contend with. And now I think after this kind of bursting of the bubble, I think we're plateauing, but at the wrong level. Like we're plateauing at a very low level at the moment. And that I'm not pleased with.
I want to talk a bit about plateauing. I mean, one of the things, just an example for everyone, and I wonder, Cornelia, if this resonates. We had one client, which obviously I won't name, but in 2021, they had coaches. So obviously when you're out fundraising, you have coaches who share feedback on your presentations that are really important. It's increasingly competitive to fundraise. And one of the coaches for a client of ours, the feedback was, just say that ESG is your top priority. And this person was the head of value creation. And that person came to us and asked, what's your take? And our take was, well, is that true? You're the head of value creation. Your top priority is value creation, no? And they said, yes, like that's a top priority. And sustainability is part of that. ESG is part of that. There are financially material aspects, but our recommendation was not to go with the coach's advice. And you and I both saw the backlash against CSR. There's a reason why ESG is not in Rico's name, because I think we could see that the zeitgeist was ESG and all boards were thinking, okay, we've got to have a net zero target and we'll figure out how to get there later. And I say all, not all boards, but there was certainly a proliferation of this sentiment. And I'd love to hear what you think of this. For us, it was almost, ESG took the center stage for the first time. With CSR, it was still sort of on the periphery and it was still more of a branding initiative, whereas ESG really took the center stage and therefore got more, I think the pressures for green hushing are greater in a way because we became part of a debate at national, international levels. The FT's Gillian Tett, who's been on the podcast, she in, I think, late 2019, she was like, she started the FT Moral Money newsletter. I mean, it was just this time of, massive step forward. Now, what's interesting, what I'd love to get your take on, Cornelia, is I think some of the headlines around retrenchment are overblown.
Yeah.
I think, in fact, it's, we're facing headwinds. And in a cyclical field where it's sort of a step forward and then pause, maybe a bit of a step back and then another step forward. But it's different than going back to a previous time that we remember and say 2015, 2016. What's your take? Where do we find ourselves now? And as we start to look to the future, what does this going from being sort of the top 1 to 5 priorities on the list to maybe not being the top 5 priorities on the list for a board in the short term?
Like recognize so much of what you're saying to the point of the client you mentioned who was coached to say, I think the sort of common sense basic rule of understanding should be do not say, say what you do what you say. And do not and yet you've got to have a really strong sense of humor to appreciate what's been going on in the last few months. I mean, the number of core value pages that disappeared overnight in the last 2 months is like, you can be depressed about it. I personally find it hilarious because really, if you can delete your core value page overnight, not so core,
That's so core.
So not so core, and you look so profoundly inconsistent. I'm guided by the principle of reality. I think I'm a very, very pragmatic operator. I think we need to appreciate those two things, two guiding principles to business: regulation and making money. Like returning value to shareholders, being able to pay your employees, making a profit, returning value to shareholders, whoever they are, be it in private markets or public markets. And you're like, this is a hammer and the anvil. Okay, you have regulation, you have to be compliant, or you're going to pay fines, which is stupid. You got to go to prison, which is a pity, and you've got to be profitable if you're a for-profit business. And I think there's so much research written about this, but there is there is a sort of additional incremental value to having a meaning, a purpose, to be a great manager, to be able to build a culture that's like the lighthouse. I mean, so much has been written about, the importance of DEI, the importance of being smart about climate risk assessment, looking around the corner at what's going to come next in terms of cybersecurity, data privacy, AI, responsible AI. I mean, I personally would not. I think we need to just boil it back down to, as an individual investor and as an employee, you want to invest in something that's going to last and that's going to still be around in 10 years. You want to work for a company that's going to succeed, grow, and still be around in 10 years. And let's just forget for a minute, like the whole debate and ESG sustainability. I think it's very common sense, to say, of course, let's focus on top line. Obviously we want to sell more and we want to do it at the lowest cost possible, but we're not working and operating in isolation. And even if you have a competitive moat, we live in a world in a business world where disruption is much more frequent. So any good business manager knows that there are risks, exogenous and endogenous risk, that sometimes it's very hard to mark your own homework. So it's important to have someone within the organization, or an advisor, trusted advisor, or a board. It's a point of corporate governance, good corporate governance, who's going to help you look around the corner, look at the known unknowns, look at the black swans, and like think about the black swans. And so what's coming next? What could disrupt my business? And I think that what's sort of mind blowing so there's an original sin, which was to those guys who didn't listen to you and went and said, yeah, yep, ESG is, I don't even know what it means, but it's our top priority. I don't think they deserve to stay in business. Like, what's next? They're going to say that responsible AI is a top priority, and they're going to wake up one morning with a major bias or an over reliance on full automation, and they're going to lose all, and they're going to sort of dilute their brand overnight. I mean, those guys who have made this mistake with ESG will make this mistake with tariffs, with a volatile geoeconomic environment, with AI. I think that what's a little bit more difficult is, and we, at General Atlantic, our DNA is that we invest in fast-growing companies. We partner with founders. We help them grow. We help build resilient businesses. And we do this across different sectors, including climate. And really the goal there is, like, when you're a founder and you've passed the seed stage, the early growth stage, I think you're still very focused on keeping the lights on. You're very focused on your growth. It's all about M&A. It's all about capturing new markets, capturing new,
time is of the
segments.
essence.
Time is absolutely of the essence.
Yeah.
You have lean teams. Sometimes you don't have a head of HR. So our roles, the role of the sustainability team I'm leading at GA is to come in and help them look around the corner and think about the anvil and the hammer. Okay, what are the existing regulation? And what are the upcoming regulations that you should be thinking about? Because you're building products, softwares, services, and you should be integrating by design. You should be integrating those considerations in the products and services that you're building. And that has nothing to do with moral posters. It's good business. And I think the other element is value creation. Of course, you'll be thinking about pricing. You'll be thinking about talent. You'll be thinking about how well are you using Salesforce, sales efficiency. You should 100% be thinking about AI. But I think the reason why founders, management team don't wake up and sort of prioritize sustainability is it's just what ESG is. That it's such a nebulous concept. Like, what does it mean? Like, even if you don't take a moral poster to that on that, it's a little scary. Like, are we going to be talking about climate change? I already think I can't do much as an individual. I'm a small company. I'm asset light. I'm not a mining company. I'm not British Airways. what am I, I'm not making steel. So what's my impact? Should I really be prioritizing this? On DEI, often they're very much in the present moment and not really thinking about the value of a diverse workforce. And by diverse, I mean all sorts of diversity, and really also cognitive diversity. What does it bring to the table? And they don't necessarily sit down, and as they grow very rapidly, they don't necessarily look at what they're losing and the value they're not protecting. So, for example, I lost 2 devs last week. I lost engineers. We know they're very costly. It's going to take a while to find a new guy, retrain him or her on the product. But I'm growing so fast, I can't really sit and think about, wait a minute, I have a pretty high turnover. Or wait a minute, my turnover is actually, if I look at the benchmark for my industry, my turnover is like much higher. So what's going on? Like, is there a culture problem, a diversity problem, is a location problem? Is it because I don't know? I could have addressed sort of a whole new segment of a certain market, maybe addressing lower income segments, and I haven't been doing that. And people are just like tired of not seeing any purpose. I think this is that's why I'm very zen to go back to your question about what's going on. I'm actually very zen about the current state of things. Like, I think that in our jobs right now, we're very much seeing the effects. It's interesting. We're seeing what policy can do and what policy can undo. And it is a bit scary sometimes. Like, it is scary to have to, delete some programs, sort of turn the volume down when you thought that you were only going to sort of progress, if not exponentially, at least sort of like the curve would go in one direction.
Hey, it's Jenn. I just wanted to take a quick moment to let you know a bit about Rico and what we do. We're a tech-enabled advisory firm that helps private market investors and companies measure sustainability metrics using our software platform. We also help you to set targets and focus your efforts on sustainability areas that really matter for your business. And finally, we help clients to translate all of this work into your core value creation strategy or your business model. Check us out at re.co.com to get in touch. All right, now back to our conversation. One thing, Cornelia, just on what you've shared, it's actually connect the point about those who go with whatever trend hits us next, or whatever headline. I call it sort of the flip-flop strategy, that wherever the winds blow, that's where we are. The obvious cost to that is you betray a lack of authenticity to both sides if there's, tension or polarization. And it struck me that the antidote to that, as you pointed out, is, purpose. And with entrepreneurs, this links to an area of focus for General Atlantic with really supporting innovators and entrepreneurs to scale and take businesses to the next level. I'm struck. So we have a rock star colleague, Emily, who I swear when she creates a slide, it's like a piece of art. I don't know how she does it. And would we have had a chance of attracting her to Rico if we didn't have a deeper purpose beyond profit? I don't think we would have had a shot. She'd done all the things. She was an engineer, and then she was at business school. She did an MBA, and then BCG. She had all of the options. But there's no way we would have attracted her without a deeper purpose. And it strikes me that for scaling companies, that's whole lesson of not falling into it must be so hard to not fall into the flip-flop camp, because you're growing quickly, you want to attract, you have to please investors, you have to please employees. So staying consistent and authentic is challenging as a leader. But if we don't do that, there are serious risks. I mean, how do you navigate this whole purpose conversation with some of the companies you come across, Cornelia?
Of course, I do think purpose is key because it's the bedrock of your culture, of your company culture, and it's the direction of travel you want to give to a workforce that is. I'll say one thing: I don't really believe in the sustainability conscious Gen Z generation. Like this, I hear a lot, but like also like the data points to something else. Like it points to a more complex reality. They don't necessarily recycle better. They do still they tend to spend a lot of time on social media, which is actually super carbon emitting. So I don't think it's as simple as that. I do think there is for sure a different relationship to work. that we know, we see it, there is a different relationship to work. There's more individualism today. So I think purpose is what unites a group and sort of combats this, like, a little bit, this individualistic sort of nature, the individualistic nature of this generation. And look, we don't come in and give them lessons. Like, I think they know their business, they know, and one thing that's very important, something I've learned, I came in from PAI, GA, honestly, not realizing how different the two contexts were. I think, and this was a huge learning curve for me, and is that, first of all, when you're a minority shareholder, you truly cannot behave or sort of, I would say, implement a sustainability strategy or sustainability conversation the way you do when you're a majority shareholder. You just cannot impose. Those are the terms of governance. You can't impose. Literally, you can't impose because you may have one seat at the board, but that's it. And you're sitting next to a bunch of other co-investors, and the founder still retains a very important share of ownership of the company. So you can only influence, which means that you can't come in and start, like, talking about a company's purpose. He knows the purpose. He knows why he's doing this. And I think we need to recognize that you cannot have this systematic, sort of obsessive, systematic approach to a growth portfolio that you may have, in different, like, for example, in other asset classes, which is where it's crucial to have a systematic approach. Like in infra, it's important to have downside risk management sort of mindset. It's important to be systematic. You can't allow for sort of, like holes, in the racket. Here, in the case of growth, I think what we had to recognize is, well, what is material and where can we move the needle? Is there sufficient value at stake, for each topic? And is there sufficient, like, sufficient CapEx and OpEx, like, at stake to warrant a conversation? And if it is not, I think we need to accept that there's not. It's fine. Here's an ESG playbook. Let's talk about, if you want to IPO, come see us, because there's a playbook. There's an ESG playbook to IPO. And there's a way of doing things that allows you to, without greenwashing, capture that sustainable passive investment out there. It's ratings, it's writing policies, it's structuring the way you report on data, it's very being cognizant of the regulation that you're operating in. So let's have this conversation when you exit, But I think that if you try to apply the same formula to everyone, it becomes a blunt instrument. With my team over the last sort of 2-3 years, we've been applying a lot of screening tools, risk screening tool, engagement screening tool. We've been doing a lot of data scraping, a lot of outside-in work, trying to understand what are the ratings on Glassdoor, what's the makeup of the sort of the board, of the management, what are the peers doing, what's the growth story of this company, and what markets are they operating. Really, if you're a consumer at a B2C apparel company operating in Europe, with a lot of raw materials, like, involved in your fibers and raw materials in your supply chain, I will have a different attitude, and I say, okay, now it's our fiduciary duty to make sure that they've put in place the roadmap around supply chain traceability, etc.
And that makes a lot of sense, having a very bespoke approach. Just like you would with any strategy, sustainability is not different than any strategic approach. It doesn't make sense to say there's one approach to strategy. Otherwise, we wouldn't have a very competitive marketplace. Now, I do want to sort of tack to the future. So obviously we're in this, moment where we're seeing green hushing and geopolitical turbulence. We've talked a little bit about that. As we turn our minds to, say, it's 2030, and, we're looking back at 2025 to 2030 from a sustainability and private equity perspective. Obviously, it's a bit of a crystal ball question, but what do you think we'll see?
So I love that question. And also, I did not have an answer to that question yesterday at 4 p.m. And then at 4:30, I had one, because, if you bear with me, I had something completely crazy happen yesterday, in my opinion. So I was at the PEI Global Impact Conference, a summit in London, and I saw this panel on AI, safety, and assurance, a short window to act. And I thought, wow, this is really interesting. I'm semi-Luddite, need to get in there. Have been using, like everyone, ChatGPT, but probably not to this fullest extent. We're thinking about AI and data centers, obviously, but let's get in that room. And the panel was insanely impressive. Like the quality of the panel was incredible. I get into a room, Jenn, we were 5 in a room with, I think, 4 of the most brilliant minds I've heard speaking about AI in the last year. And I read everything that comes from the labs. I've been, I was at the OPSWF AI Summit in Paris, and my brain split, during this fascinating 15 minutes panel we had. Half of my brain was listening to those brilliant, brilliant guys explaining to you that in 3-4 years, we'll have an NVIDIA moment on AI safety, so the pioneers of AI safety and assurance. They were saying things that, today, when you look at benchmarks between what a human expert will do and what an AI will do, putting aside the issue of inference, it's not science fiction that in 5 years, it's not just call centers that will have disappeared, but the majority of the jobs as we know them will be completely obsolete. It's just a fact of life. If a very, very good dev, and they were talking about PhD in AI, researchers, guys who code all day long, very complex models. Today, 45% of their code is written by an AI. And they think that in 3 years, it will be 90%. Okay, so we're investing, for example, in, half of our portfolio is tech, the rest is tech enabled. So I was thinking, and the second part of my brain was like, why are we 5 in this room? And I just realized, wait a minute, this reminds me of this panel I was in 2017 around climate risk and net zero and climate change. And I was on the panel speaking, and it was pretty humiliating. There were 7 people in the room, and I think it's the mix of, I don't know, fear of the topic, the sort of wrong impression that it will be solved by the regulator, that you can't do anything that you could still keep going on. I like an sort of err towards the inaction, and or that there's going to be a Deus ex machina that's going to come in and solve it for you. But I think to answer your question, in 2035, all the challenges we're discussing today, all the work we're doing is profoundly disrupted by artificial intelligence. And there's going to be a necessity. And, in some ways, I'm not going to go into AI for good. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of great applications. It's an instrument that has really great and also really scary applications. But the point is, we need to be asking ourselves today the question of reliance and the question of education and training. And similarly to climate change, I think we need to be just less scared about how it impacts our work. How do we make it an instrument for what we do in sustainability? And yeah, recognizing the risks,
One of the things that's striking me, Cornelia, as you make this point is perhaps because in our career, sustainability has not been fixed. Like, it has changed. We've seen a lot of change. I think if you came into the field in 2020, you'd have an idea of what it means. But actually, I think it's quite clear that what it means is changing based on the evolving risks and opportunities that affect, businesses and happen to have non-financial, financially material, indicators, right? It's just a broader conversation. It's not just about carbon emissions. And also, as we struggle to reduce emissions, climate adaptation is going to become more important over the next couple of years. There are things that are changing. And I think what really strikes me is, the fact that you've been leading in this sphere for long enough to see that we can really continue to lead and to push the envelope in ways that are going to matter to our portfolios. It's just we can't rest on our laurels and say, okay, for the past 5 years, we focused ESG data collection in these areas, and therefore that's our jobs. No, it's what are the pressing challenges that are facing us, and how do we shape our work around that? We could get into this, I'm sure that you and I could grab a glass of wine and get into many layers of this. And at the same time, I'm conscious that I've already taken up quite a bit of your time today, and want to sort of move into, you were talking about going to conferences and, reading and staying up to speed. I'm just wondering, before I ask my favorite book question, what do you do to keep up to date? Like, are there particular things that you read, or when you get interested in a new theme, how do you get up to speed?
That's so topical, because that's exactly what I'm trying to do with AI. I'm a mom of 2 with two boys under on the force. So there's not a lot of time to get to stay smart on what's on the march of the world. Podcast is the life for me. Yeah, big fan of the FT. I read religiously and didn't TED in particular. So recently I've been listening to podcasts on AI and defense, because they're an intersection of two topics that are very interesting as a sustainability professional. We're going to be investing in the coming years more in defense. It's starting already in the venture sector and in the growth sector in Europe. And we need to form an opinion, on ESG and defense and how they're not necessarily opposing. So yeah, so I think I'm trying to do that. So Technotic is one of them, and Rico, obviously, in the last few weeks
That was the right answer.
No, there's a, but
in terms of books, so my final question for you, Cornelia, is, if there's one book that's most influenced the way you think, what book would that be?
It's quite personal book that has been gifted to me recently. Is I don't know if you've read Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning. It was given to me sort of more on around a personal conversation, and it's just, and obviously just for context, it's written by Viktor Frankl, who's the founder of the logotherapy third school of psychology, who survived Auschwitz and other camps, and lost his entire family, including his wife, and wrote this very short book. It reads in an hour, it reads, and what is incredible is that it doesn't read like the books that, the testimonies that have sometimes been written by survivors of this. It's written through the lens of academia. Like, it's written by the man experiencing something and deciding that he's going to put his experience on paper through his scientific lens. So it's very brave and very interesting. But also the second part is, it's really about, man's search for meaning. And I think it connects back to the discussion we've had through this whole podcast. This discussion is, it's always the right time to do the right thing. It's sort of what I took away from it. And, if you're a sustainability professional right now, you might be a little disenchanted, a little jaded or scared, or you might be looking for a job right now because, you might have lost your job. I think that the nature of pendulum is that it does swing back, number one. But number two, if you're guided by a strong purpose and if you have strong moral ambition, I think you're going to live anyway and enrich your life. So I found it profoundly inspiring.
Cornelia, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. It was wonderful.
The Future in Sound podcast is written and hosted by Jenn Wilson and produced by Chris Attaway. This podcast is brought to you by Rico, a tech-powered advisory company helping private market investors pursue sustainability objectives and value creation in tandem. If you enjoyed this podcast, don't forget to tell a friend about it. And if you have a moment to rate us in your podcast app, we'd really appreciate it. Until next time, thanks for listening.